The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. In April 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its external debt service commitments, and the government announced suspension of repayment of external debt. By May of the same year, Sri Lanka was formally in default. Since then, Sri Lanka has turned to the International Monetary Fund to contain the 2022 crisis and build a foundation for sustainable and inclusive growth. Together, the country and the IMF have agreed on a comprehensive economic reform program to address the causes of the crisis. What has been the progress thus far? How is Sri Lanka faring? Let's find out by having the conversations. I'm so pleased to welcome to the studio and to Sri Lanka Professor Jayati Ghosh, Professor, University of Massachusetts. Good evening and welcome, Professor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful to have you here. I'm also pleased to welcome to the studio Kristina Rehbein. Welcome to the show, Kristina.
Thanks so much. Very pleased to be here.
My first question is to Professor Jayati Ghosh. When we speak about debt crises in countries, this term has become quite ubiquitous. It's not just something unique to Sri Lanka. How can we contextualize Sri Lanka's debt crisis in terms of what is happening in other developing countries? Are there common traits?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think it's very interesting in Sri Lanka that it's presented as if it's unique and it's a result of corruption and mismanagement of the previous Rajapaksa government, rather than part of a very broad tendency that is now afflicting about 72 countries in the world. And so what are the elements of this? You know, we have had these debt cycles where countries take on debt and then after a few years face a major debt crisis ever since really the 1970s. Yeah. And some of it is driven by the fact that certain countries get, if you like, become attractive to global capital. And so they receive a lot of funds, which earlier they would not have received, for whatever reason. Sometimes it's because global monetary policy has eased. Sometimes it's because they're looking for alternative areas for investment. When you get this money, the capital flows in and it causes the real exchange rate to go up, to appreciate. And that means that exporting becomes more difficult because your exports are more expensive. Importing becomes easier because imports are cheaper. And so a lot of importing substitution production actually doesn't happen. That gives you a trade deficit. Over time, that increases at some point. And that point can happen for all kinds of reasons. It can happen for political reasons. It can happen because your neighboring country has a crisis. It can happen for some kind of monetary policy change or some other policy change. At some point, capital decides they don't want to come anymore. And so they stop that easy access to borrowing. Right. And the minute they move, then you have a crisis. In this particular case, the COVID pandemic actually generated a crisis for many, many countries because exports went down for a whole range of things. Tourism revenues went down, remittances went down, and all of that impacted balance of payments. And then just after the COVID pandemic was easing, we saw monetary policy being tightened in the rich countries. So bank capital moves back to those countries. And so across the board, you have seen a wave of debt distress. Some actual defaults, but some just very, very high debt repayments which are being extracted out of populations at the expense of spending on health, education, nutrition, social protection. In fact, in more than half of low-income countries, they're spending more on debt repayment than on all of this put together. And in all the low and middle income countries, other than a few like China and India and so on, in all of them, they're spending more than they are on health. Just on debt repayment.
Right. Kristina, I'd like to come to you. You work as a political coordinator of the German Nationwide Debt and Development Network, Jubilee Germany, and you're also a member of the board of the European Network on Debt and Development. You've been involved in sovereign debt justice activities for the longest time. How do you view the IMF program and the debt restructuring process in Sri Lanka, and what is your reading of a potential outcome?
I think when it comes to Sri Lanka, it's a very emblematic case of the kind of, let's say, rotten debt architecture that we see when it comes to, dealing with the debt crisis.
Right.
So when we look at the IMF program particularly, right, it's not only Sri Lanka that is in default or that needs a debt restructuring. There are a couple of other countries that are also in the debt restructuring, and they have all of them, be it Zambia, be it Ghana, be it Sri Lanka, they have very common traits on the way the crisis is being dealt with. But when it comes to Sri Lanka particularly and the IMF program, if you actually look into the program and you look into targets, so what the IMF says, which level of debt is sustainable, what is actually needed to say, okay, this is enough in debt relief, right? These targets compared to other countries are very, very unambitious, very high. So for instance, the IMF says, for Sri Lanka, a 95% of debt to GDP is absolutely fine. That's sustainable. That's very high. It's absolutely not sustainable. It actually even writes in the agreement, you can actually open the document and read it transparently. It says, even with this debt restructuring, the debt vulnerabilities will still remain high. The debt crisis is actually not going to be resolved. It actually says, actually everything that we assume about future economic growth, assumptions about how much austerity we can actually ask from Sri Lanka, that's far too optimistic. It's all in there. Still, they put the stamp and say, this is if Sri Lanka is just following this path that we say in this program, kind of the crisis is going to be over. But it even says it's not going, it's really written there. And the main reason for that is that the creditors that Sri Lanka has to negotiate with, they are just not prepared to accept losses, right? They actually want their money back. And what the IMF is doing is kind of saying, or kind of legitimizing, kind of, rather looking at creditor interests, trying to push through creditor interests and not put Sri Lanka's economic recovery path as priority, right? So what we are going to see is, in the end, if we have an outcome, if we have an agreement, right? If creditors are going to sign an agreement, minimal debt relief, it will mean that Sri Lanka may be back into default, maybe back into onto the debt restructuring negotiation table a few years down the road, may actually need an 18th IMF program. That's actually already set, if you like. It's already there. And still, everyone, be it from the IMF to the creditors, they know about that. It's not that they even hide it very well, right? They just say okay, we know it's actually very unambitious. We know it's not enough, but sorry, we cannot do any much more than that. And so this is the kind of situation Sri Lanka is in, and this has nothing to do kind of with Sri Lanka's fiscal management, right? It's not Sri Lanka's fault. Sri Lanka was just from the IMF managing director. She said the way Sri Lanka is fulfilling the IMF program, it's so great. It's really to the dot, and it's really doing all its homework. But it will not be enough, right, in the end, because the program is as unambitious as it is and looking at creditor interests.
Yeah, I want to add to that, because it's not just unambitious, it's actually wrong. It's actually designed to hurt the poor and the working people and the farmers rather than the creditors. So now let's consider this. Sri Lanka goes and gets international sovereign bonds from about, they really started going up from about 2014 onwards, right? You first issued one in 2009, but they went up from 2014 onwards. Most of those bonds, the money there was essentially used to repay other debt to the international financial institutions, to the IMF and the World Bank. And the people buying those bonds knew that. When I say people, it's big companies, right? The big financial companies that are managing funds. They knew that. And yet they kept doing this. They demanded a very high return because they said it's risky. So Sri Lanka is paying 8-9% interest on these bonds. Very, very high coupon rates, and the yield is rising constantly. And that's for risk premium. When it comes to the crunch, when in fact the risk fructifies, when yes, Sri Lanka is unable to repay, the creditors say, no, we are not going to accept any risk. We want 100% repayment.
Right.
So that's unfair, right? You can't demand a high premium because of the risk and then say, well, no, we won't take any risk. What is the IMF doing? The IMF has done two very critical things that have completely distorted the whole restructuring picture. One, it has clubbed together the domestic and the international debt, the foreign exchange debt. Now, Sri Lanka's problem is not in the domestic debt. It's in foreign exchange. You need foreign exchange to pay for these liabilities. That's right. You have to service the dollar debts. That's where you need to actually reduce it. Okay. By clubbing it together, they are actually forcing a lot of adjustment on those who are holding debt in Sri Lankan rupees. And think of the big players holding that debt. Some of it is domestic banks. They have been let off because they know there would be a banking crisis if they allowed that to happen. It's the pension funds. So you are attacking the pension funds of some of the poorest workers in the country. Plantation workers, garment workers, a lot of women very, very badly affected because the value of their pension funds is going to be declining over time. And why is this? This is to reduce the debt reduction that these big creditors would have to make. Now, that's number one choice that they've made. The second is, in fact, in the IMF's debt sustainability analysis itself. This has huge problems. And it's really extraordinary that everybody thinks that this is written in stone. It's the gold standard for how to deal with debt, because it's actually really wrong. It makes crazy assumptions about growth. As you say, very optimistic. It says that, oh yes, GDP is going to grow. Why? Because suddenly there will be investor confidence. Even though you are clamping down on public spending, you are increasing the cost of living and travel and everything for ordinary people. So they will have less money to buy. There's been a shrinking of domestic demand, but the economy is going to grow. How? On what basis? And if that economy doesn't grow, then you're really in a worse soup than you were before. I would say it's not just unambitious. This IMF program is a recipe for disaster. You have already experienced a dramatic decline in real incomes. You're going to experience more decline in the real incomes of the poor. The rich, meanwhile, will be fine. The same rich who are talking about corruption of the past are going to be fine with this program. So there is a real class element to this, and there's a real international inequality element to this.
Sure. Kristina, what are your thoughts on this corruption narrative? Do you feel like we're letting corrupt elites get away at the expense of the working classes, at the expense of the masses? Why aren't we bringing the creditors by their necks and putting them in the middle of the discussion table?
Yeah, this whole narrative about, well, the whole reason for a debt crisis in general, that's corruption, mismanagement of a government, and if we cancel any debt, we will let them off the hook. That's the standard and very beloved argument of Western governments, of creditors in general, and unfortunately because of that also of the general public. It's not only on Sri Lanka, it's each and every debt crisis. Like Jubilee Germany is involved in a kind of monitoring sovereign debt issues since 25 years. That was an argument 25 years ago, right? That there was a big debt relief initiative for lower income countries, and it was all about, but these countries that were so corrupt, how can we actually cancel any debt, right? So mismanagement may be one part of, let's say, 10 parts of a story. It's definitely, generally, when there is a debt crisis, the causes are much more diverse, much more structural, and I think the main issue about this corruption narrative or this mismanagement narrative is actually distracting from that there is also responsibility on the other side. So it's like all responsibility for a crisis pushing onto a country. So when a creditor actually comes in and says, oh, I'm going to negotiate with you and maybe cancel debt, that this is a kind of goodwill from my side. But usually when there is a loan, each loan kind of contraction, also when it comes to a debt crisis, there's always two sides to a story. There's always a responsibility on the creditor side as well. So like Jayati explained a bit about the kind of 70s and the kind of like the capital export from the global north to emerging economies. And you know, after the financial crisis, there was so much abundant liquidity. No one really looked at repayment capacities of countries, right? They just pushed all this capital into emerging economies to kind of, well, make some profit. And this kind of responsibility, right? This side of the coin, this is actually being kind of, well, distracted from with this kind of corruption narrative, which resonates very well, especially with, let's say, Western countries, right? So it's actually, as said, it's going to kind of hide responsibility. It actually makes debt crisis resolution much more complicated, right? And when I look into, like, generally the way how when it comes to debt, this is being dealt with. If you look into domestic law, right? You actually do have insolvency laws. So when it comes to debt of a company, debt of a private person, right? if there is a problem, if there is a debt crisis, right, you have a kind of right to go to court, a right to go into insolvency and kind of negotiate about your debt and get debt cancellation. It's not some mercy or whatever, some charity, and it's no one asks about, or no one is going to say, this is because you, I don't know, mismanage your funds or whatever, your loans, you don't get any debt relief. It is your right. And this kind of legal framework, this kind of attitude doesn't exist for sovereign debt. Sovereign debt is the only category where you don't have an overarching legal framework to deal with. So there it's like, it's very much creditor driven. It's actually creditors kind of making the criteria, making kind of saying, this is the way we are going to, deal with the debt crisis. That's why the IMF is at the center of this whole process, and the corruption kind of plays a role in making sure creditors do not have to take a bigger hit.
Okay, Professor Jayati, do you think colonialism has something to do with South Asian countries like Sri Lanka not being able to negotiate with the full power and strength that it must?
Well, some of it is that, but there is the other unfortunate reality, I suppose you could call it a form of neo-colonialism, which is that our domestic elites don't have the interests of the people at heart.
Okay.
And that's not corruption, that's a deeper issue.
Sure.
They may be perfectly honest and not corrupt in their daily dealings, but they have, number one, they have absorbed that particular outlook, that mental approach to it. And number two, they are not the ones who are really going to be suffering.
Yeah.
If you dramatically increase the price of necessities, of food, of fuel, and so on, the rich are not badly affected, relatively speaking. And certainly even the pension funds, it's not that big a deal. It's the poor who are affected. And so I think a large part of this willingness to go along with the IMF pain and to say that, no, it's necessary for us because we were wrong, we were bad, we had this bad government, so now we have to suffer. That's really another way of passing all of the costs of adjustment on to, in fact, the poor. But there is another problem, and I really want to emphasize this. It's not just the creditors that have to take the blame. The IMF really also needs to take the blame. This is your 17th IMF program, right? And everyone says, oh, it's Sri Lanka's fault, it's our 17th program. Excuse me, what was the IMF doing? You were in an IMF program when you started taking all those ISBs. And the IMF could see that this is Ponzi financing, that you are borrowing to repay another creditor. Why did the IMF allow this? Why did the IMF encourage this? Why did the IMF more or less draw you into your next debt crisis while it was already so supervising your economy? And the fact that the IMF then says, oh, we won't take any haircut, we're not going to accept any blame, we are the ones to tell you how to get out of this, we are the ones to give you the solution, that's completely wrong. I can tell you so many scores of countries that have taken the IMF medicine and suffered for decades. A lost decade, a lost 2 decades. There are real problems with just accepting uncritically an international institution that so clearly has the interests of private creditors at heart, and that is not really allowing for a strategy that will enable you to get out of this by growing out of this.
Right.
Maybe I can add to that, you could actually read it like the 17th IMF program, actually I think the 18th already being at the horizon. You could actually read it that the whole macroeconomic policy making, actually the whole development path in a way was kind of contracted out to the IMF, right? It is like there was actually no sovereignty of Sri Lanka for the past decades when it comes to the whole economic development model, because there were all these IMF programs. I think there is also a bit like the understanding, the IMF in the first place is a lender of last resort, right? But the role is so much bigger. It's actually really setting the macroeconomic parameters of decision making and thinking, right? Of even thinking, because you don't only have programs, you also have surveillance functions, right? The IMF is in each and every country minimum once a year. It's like when it comes to debt restructurings, actually I think, which is also a very important point, everyone is always talking about there is no alternative to the IMF, right? The IMF must be involved. Actually, there's no international law is not enshrining the IMF, kind of that the country must have the IMF involved, right? The only legal reason that the IMF needs to be involved is when it lends, and actually the country doesn't have to go to the IMF, right? You don't need to take a loan from the IMF, but especially official creditors, and I must say that this includes the country I'm coming from, they make it mandatory, right? When a country wants to restructure its debt and wants to negotiate with them, first it must have an IMF program. They don't even have to come through the door. If there's no IMF program, you can actually leave. So they kind of make it a kind of quasi-legal monopoly of the IMF, just because they say you must have an IMF program, and when you have that, you can come back. And then lending is involved, and then you have this but it's not international law, right? It's not that the IMF kind of need to have this monopoly, but it's kind of because of this creditor structures and this creditor-driven system, right? The countries are being forced into this kind of macroeconomic, giving away, let's say, your macroeconomic policy making.
Kristina, take us through some of the previous debt crises across the world, and how have they been handled? What are we doing wrong?
Well, actually, I mean, when it comes to Sri Lanka, it's the first time that Sri Lanka is in a default, right? But debt crises have been there forever, let's say, right? It's not very exceptional, actually, right? You had waves of debt crisis throughout history, and it's a very normal phenomena of modern capitalism, right? That you have unsustainable debt and defaults. But when looking at, let's say, be it the 80s or be it the 90s, right? And now look into the way debt crises are being handled today, it's like repeating history. And it's also repeating mistakes of history, let's say. So lessons have not been learned at all. Today the creditor profile may be a bit different, right? In the past, like in the 80s, in the Latin America debt crisis, you had mainly commercial banks, right? Then in the 90s, you had especially a dominance of Western so-called Paris Club creditors. When you look today, there's China much more involved, right? And so you have a much more complex creditor profile with kind of the more traditional donors, right? Not having, when it comes to volumes, not much of a dominant role, but still kind of defining the whole system. So, but when it comes to how it has been dealt with, right?
And private creditors.
And
More
of
than
course.
half are private creditors. That's
Absolutely, yeah. So it's like the absolute dominance of, like when you actually look at also today's debt crisis and the kind of common traits, right? When it comes to debt distress, most of them kind of had this commercial borrowing path that Sri Lanka had. Right now, I think it's like a 60% of the global of the debt stock of emerging economies, right? That's with private creditors, right? But even if you have this changing creditor profile throughout history, let's say, the way it has been dealt with is super similar, right? You had usually too shallow debt treatments to restore debt sustainability. You had repeated reschedulings, right? There were countries, on average, for instance, when it comes to the African continent, they had to negotiate with on the same debt, right? Negotiate on the same debt with the Paris Club 7 times on average, and kind of until they really had an exit of the debt crisis. There were countries actually negotiating 14 times, right? And then, I mean, you had like 20 years passing, and you had like economic devastation, you had poverty rising. You actually also had high costs for creditors, right? So that's the kind of, you had these too shallow reschedulings, and then at some point you may have had like a big debt relief initiative kind of cancelling everything because it was already kind of, and this lesson of you need to do it right and directly do it right, and everyone is going to benefit, also the creditor side. No one learned this lesson, and we see exactly the same pattern not only in Sri Lanka, right? So you see that kind of absolute minimum consensus on debt relief, but you also see things like when it comes to private creditors, but not only, but mainly, they need, even for the very minimum concession that they are prepared to give, you still need to give them sweeteners, right? When it comes to Sri Lanka, they discuss something like macro-linked bonds. So the whole idea is actually, okay, we give you debt relief, but then later on, when your economy performs better, we actually want to participate in that. So we may get either kind of the kind of debt relief, kind of our remaining debt repayments faster. It may mean we actually get some money back, right? There are some examples like Suriname in Latin America, actually creditors that gave really minimum, the most minimum debt relief, not even enough, right? The IMF said they actually had to give much more, but they didn't, and still the IMF said sustainable, by the way. But still they were able, through the kind of debt restructuring, to grab future oil revenues, right? Because without, they would not even have said yes to a minimum agreement. And you see this in each and every debt restructuring today. And this kind of kicking the can down the road, kind of hoping that the country is going to grow out of its debt. This is everything that happened in the 80s, that happened in the 90s, right? It's each and every debt crisis. And we really need brave be it governments, brave institutions, kind of to learn this lesson, because it's going to be, when it comes to global stability, when it comes to economic and social stability in the country, but also in general when it comes to the costs to creditors, right? Everyone is just going to lose, right? So even the creditors are not going to win anything from that.
When she was saying that the world hasn't learned anything, absolutely right. But they knew how to do it correctly. They did this in the London debt agreement with Germany, her country, when Germany was a major debtor. Right. And it was recognized that this is unsustainable debt. The creditors got together in London in 1953. They effectively cancelled half of the debt by basically saying this is all now transfers. And the other half, they put on very low interest rate, long-term loans, which limited the interest payments to 5% of exports every year. Can you imagine? Now, that's really underlying reasons for the German post-war miracle.
Wow.
Because it made everybody else a stakeholder in Germany's rising exports, but it also limited the amount of debt service you were paying.
Yeah.
If the developing countries could get a deal like that today, there would be no stopping them.
But who's going to be that altruistic?
It was actually not altruistic, right? There were very clear interests, right?
They wanted West Germany to grow.
Sure.
Now, I would argue that supposing that's the gold standard of debt relief, developing countries, we have to stop being so ashamed, embarrassed, and alone. We have to actually get together, coordinate, compare notes. In Sri Lanka, for example, you got domestic debt clubbed together with external debt, which is a disaster and which is wrong. In Ghana, they resisted, and they did not get this with the same IMF. You need to talk to each other, figure out how to actually have the best strategies. You need to coordinate your positions. And a group of debtor countries talking together has much more power than an individual. So you really have to be thinking much more creatively about how do we get out of this mess, and not just waiting for the IMF to come and tell you something, which in 2 years' time you will know how wrong it is. You will be experiencing the tragedy of knowing that this was a terrible strategy. Before that, you need to be thinking out of the box yourselves. What do we really need? Last year you had $1.6 billion of current account surplus. You don't really need external money. It's not like you need that pathetic 800 million a year that the IMF is giving you. You don't need that. You need that, why? To give confidence to all other creditors. Right now, you don't need other creditors. Right now, you should be thinking, what do we want for a development strategy that will enable us to grow over time, to develop? And let's think of all the things we can do with our own resources. And where we need to import, let's try and generate the money, the foreign exchange, which you clearly can, to earn that and use those foreign exchange whenever we need it. Instead of falling for the trap that, look, the IMF is telling you to do this, and we know it hasn't worked in 87 other countries, we know it hasn't worked in Sri Lanka for 17-year times, but we will keep doing that. That, to me, is a major failure of the policy imagination in this country. And I think that really needs to change.
Speak to us also about what is happening at the United Nations level to address debt crises across the world.
Yeah, this is one of those things which now there's much more knowledge about globally.
Right.
Because everyone is recognizing that the IMF systems are not working. The common framework of the G20 countries that they set up, that's not working. The debt roundtable that the IMF set up, that's not working. Nothing's working, right? None of these attempts to address the debt crisis has really got any traction. And in fact, most debtor countries don't even want to go there because they know it will take forever. Chad took, 3.5 years? It still hasn't got a resolution, and so on. And nothing helps, okay? So there is much more now in terms of really active proposals in terms of dealing with the debt crisis. I was part of, it's a UN high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. We gave our report to the Secretary General last year in April. And in one section of that, we've talked specifically about the debt crisis and what needs to be done. And in that, we have argued that you have to have a system in which all creditors are forced to the table. That is not that, oh, please come, Mr. Private Creditor, please come. Everybody is forced to the table. That in the period of the negotiation, there is a standstill on debt payment. So what is a standstill? It is really that your debt gets frozen. It doesn't mean that if it's taking 5 years, in the meantime, the interest payments will accumulate and you will end up with a bigger debt. It means you will have that same debt, So that's an incentive for creditors to do it quickly.
Right. Sure.
And that's a very important part of really ensuring a debt negotiation that works. We need legal changes in New York and London because 95% of the sovereign debt contracts are in these two locations. But fortunately, right now in New York, there are two legislations which are in progress, which might actually force private creditors to the table as well. Also, we had recommended that we have to have much more issue of special drawing rights by the IMF, because that's a relatively painless way of making money available, foreign exchange available to poor countries. And so we had said you should increase SDRs every year by the amount that of global GDP, so that its share of global GDP remains the same. That would be about, let's say, 240, 250 billion every year, which is actually a lot of money. And if you then say we are going to distribute it not according to IMF quota, because that makes no sense. It's all these rich countries who get it and they'll never use it, right? 60% goes to countries who will never use the IMF SDRs. So give it instead, half of it for climate action. Right? But the other half, give it to countries who are experiencing shocks that are not of their own making. A climate shock, a terms of trade shock, an interest rate shock. You know, like when the US raises interest rates, then bam, your capital flies out. Sri Lanka is a good candidate for these. You are, you're climate prone. You faced an interest rate shock. So there are proposals out there. They need a lot more international support to gain traction. But that really also means more people should be aware of them to make those demands of the global system.
Maybe I can add to the UN level, right?
Yes.
In what ways that actually plays a role or could play a role. Two things. The one is that, when it comes to this whole discussion on debt restructurings and a better system, right? This kind of discussion is already also decade old, right? You have kind of swings, right? Up and down. Like sometimes it's like even the IMF in 22 kind of proposed something like a sovereign insolvency mechanism, right? So there are these upswings, and the UN was usually the place because you have different from the international financial institutions like the IMF, right? Because you have equal voting rights, because you have for developing countries a much bigger voice, right? It was always the place to discuss these kind of issues when it comes to, on the one hand, a technical macroeconomic issue, but that has so many, when it comes to a just financial architecture, right? So many implications. And for instance, in 2014, 2015, there was in the United Nations a process to establish a legal framework on multilateral debt restructurings. Then this was being blocked by creditor countries. But right now, right, what is different from all these kind of times before when these things have been discussed, be it 22 or be it 2015 or 2014, 2015, right now you have actually a kind of global acknowledgement everywhere, be it on the creditor side, on the IMF side, on the debtor side, on wherever, right, that there is a debt problem, a global debt problem, and that we actually don't have a system that can deal with it, right? You have this kind of discussion. You have lots of other discussions like that when it comes to the sustainable development goals, right, that actually debt vulnerabilities prevent that countries can still reach them in 2030. You have these kind of discussions when it comes to climate change, right, and the way climate change can be financed. That is a problem, right? So you have all these discussion dynamics in a way, and then you have the political ambition, especially on the country level, right, and you have the total kind of disparity between the two, the acknowledgement and the rhetorics and the discussion, and then what happens on the country level like Sri Lanka. But what we see, and what is also different to all these times before, we see debtor nations, right, kind of coordinate each other and raising their voice, right, be it in concrete coordination fora. There's something that's called the Vulnerable 20, which is 54 climate vulnerable countries that actually make very concrete demands to the financial system, to the IMF, to kind of really saying this is what we think, how elements of the financial architecture should be changed. We do have kind of demands everywhere in a way. So there was the Africa Climate Summit in 2023 in Kenya, for instance. There was wherever, right? Everywhere it's actually debtor nations saying we would like to have the G20 common framework that she was just mentioning, which is a framework to restructure that, another creditor forum in a way. They say, like, we want all this to kind of have this evaluated and then take lessons from that to actually make debt restructurings better and have this discussed and decided at the fourth Financing for Development conference in Spain next year.
In fact, that's what I was just going to say, that you see the place that Sri Lanka should really get involved, and certainly the next government should play an active role, is in the Financing for Development Forum, which is going to happen next year in Spain.
Right.
And in that, the debt resolution issue is a major track. And so this is a place where developing countries, especially debtor countries, can come together, can not just exchange notes, but put forward common proposals.
Right.
And I want to emphasize that a group of debtor countries together has much, much more power than an individual debtor. It is very important for Sri Lanka to get together with others who are facing very similar circumstances. And in each case, you're being told it's corruption, mismanagement, stupidity, etc. Greed, I don't know, etc. All of you need to get together, coordinate your positions, make those demands heard, and actually move away from this dependence on the IMF, which is seen as the technical gold standard. It is not. And on this reliance on, going individually to a room with all the creditors who then give you a hard time, instead of being able to combine with other debtors and recognizing that it's two hands to clap. Both have to actually take some responsibility.
Yeah,
and the United Nations could actually play a role of being an alternative, right, when it comes to very concretely issuing a debt sustainability analysis, right? The UN bodies could kind of play this role as the IMF is doing right now. It could actually be that they help organizing a debt restructuring process, right, without having like this creditor-driven system, right? They could actually give process support. They could actually, I think that was one proposal also from debtor nations saying, well, if there's a conflict, right, between us and creditor positions, right? Why not having something like a mediator pool at the UN Secretary General, right? And then, so these kind of concrete elements, right, the UN can play this role. The issue is that when it comes to creditor nations, Western nations, right, they try to keep the whole discussion of debt out of the UN and only have this at the IMF, right? But for the reason because there the voting shares are the highest. But that's why it's so important that debtor nations, as Jayati just said, need to coordinate more in this.
You have to remember the IMF is completely determined by the US and Europe. They control all of its actions because of the voting shares. And so they will necessarily reflect the interests of large capital in their own countries. That's who they represent. They're not just a sort of technical institution with the framework out there. They represent very clear economic interests. And to confront those, you have to have the technical capacity, but you also have to have the combination. I would argue in Sri Lanka, you have to have your own debt sustainability analysis. You shouldn't be relying on the IMF to tell you, because I can tell you, having looked at it, it's completely flawed. And it will not occur. In other words, none of the results that they're prophesying will actually, those outcomes will not happen. But you need to have your own and think of a debt sustainability analysis that fits in with your own vision for your economy and society. And then you can share that with other countries and put it also in a broader multilateral framework.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Professor Jayati, you're also a feminist economist and you've written extensively on the gendered impacts of debt and austerity. What are some of your key concerns, given the fact that it is the women who have to bear a disproportionate burden, given the fact that the care burden is carried by the women of Sri Lanka, given the fact that there is so much multidimensional vulnerability?
Yes, this is, again, it's unfortunately Sri Lanka is not alone, but I think it's actually very extreme in Sri Lanka, the way this is playing out, because it's sort of multiple whammies. On the one hand, you have a restriction on public spending, so they're reducing the spending on health and education and things that directly affect women and add, as you said, to the unpaid care burden. So that's number one. And, many families cannot afford the health care. And so there's a lot of stuff happening within households and so on. Then you're raising the price of essentials, of fuel, of food. And that, in turn, impacts women and girls much, much more. Women are responsible for the provisioning, but they also tend to do self-denial. And so they end up eating less, worse nutrition, and all of those features. Yeah. And of course, they end up traveling less because of the costs of travel and transport, bus prices, train prices, all of those things. But what is the triple whammy is on the pension funds. You have so many poor women working in plantations, in the garment sector. All of their pensions are being hit, whereas the savings of the rich are not touched. To me, that is an obscenity that should not be allowed. And yet it is something that the IMF proposes to save the international creditors who have already made massive profits on the Sri Lankan debt. And it is something that this government accepts, because I won't say it's gender blind. I think our governments now are gender exploitative. They exploit the fact that care work will keep on happening, that you will not withdraw care because you're not getting paid for it, or because there's more of it and it means you have less leisure or less time to even survive. Women will keep on doing this, and governments know this and they exploit this.
Gender exploitative governments.
Yes, I'm afraid it's the same in India and in many, many other countries.
That is just heartbreaking. Kristina, let's talk a bit about the concept of the right to cancel debt. I feel like it's such an uncomfortable concept. I mean, what are the ethics of cancelling debt? I feel like there's a lot wrong with that concept, but then what do you do?
Can I quickly, before Kristina says?
Sure.
No capitalist system can survive without debt cancellation. It's a regular process of any market economy. It's happening all the time. I'm sure there are millions of rupees of debt being cancelled for large businesses in Sri Lanka as we speak. I know in India we have billions of rupees of debt cancelled for corporations every year. It's a regular part of all market processes.
Okay. Kristina?
And I think when it comes to, so this right to cancel debt, right? The concept, let's say this is enshrined in insolvency laws, right? In domestic insolvency laws, but also when it comes to discussions of an overarching legal framework on sovereign debt. And I mean, the whole idea behind is not that just, I mean, anyone can take any debt and then say, okay, let's cancel, right? You always need the other side, right?
Yeah.
That gives you a loan. And so, I mean, there is in a capitalist system, loans, the kind of credit-based system, I mean, that's kind of at the heart. But as she says, right, it cannot survive, right? If you have at some point, right, all the kind of capital just concentrated in a very few hands. And when it comes to this whole idea about the right to cancel, what we just discussed all the time, right, this kind of polarization which takes place without any rules, right? I mean, insolvency laws, even in the Bible, right, you can find regulations to make sure that you don't have, because of for whatever reasons, right, you get concentration, kind of more independencies, right, and more inequality for whatever reason, right, at some point they try to get this back into a system which is more equal, because that will benefit everyone, right, because it will kind of prevent polarization of societies, right, which then may end up in, be it war or whatever, right, so it's really making sure that the system can work, right, so it's more about making sure when there is a problem, and it will come, right? As long as there's a loan out there, right? There's always a risk of unsustainable debt. And when that comes, you need, you have two principles that are in conflict. The one is the legitimate right of a creditor to get its money back, and then, in a way, the kind of survival of the debtor nation, the kind of public duties of a debtor nation when it comes to its own population, to the rights of this population, right? And you have these two in conflict, right? And the whole idea about insolvency laws kind of try to find a balance and put this first, because this is going to, so this in the sense of the priority of, let's say, life and dignity, right? But this will benefit in the end even the capitalist system, right? So that's why you have insolvency laws, because if you don't have them, right? And that's what we see when you kind of, the history of that crisis is kind of, because of this lack of these kind of rules, right, it's impoverishment. It actually means when it comes to creditors, right, it means you lose export markets, whatever, right, you kind of lose, like the capitalist system is going to lose if you don't have these kind of regulations. And when you were just talking about London 1953, right, so the kind of German debt cancellation, right, that was actually, let's say, in a way the right, like enshrining this without any regulation, right? Just because there were, I mean, it was of course not altruistic, right? It had very clear geopolitical interests, right?
Okay.
But it was taking as a priority the social economic recovery of the debtor nation, which then benefited everyone, right? Germany never had a debt crisis, I think, for I don't know how many, for long. And it's not only Germany, there are other examples, right? Indonesia 1969, Poland 1991, right? So you have these few examples that actually kind of, without this kind of right, in the sense of law, legislation, and the kind of rules, right? But give the inspiration, if you have it, right, it's going to benefit the whole system.
All right. We're on to our final 5 minutes, so I'd like to ask the two of you for your closing remarks. What is the way forward? There's one sentence in an article by Professor Kanchana Ruanpura which appealed to me, and I thought I'd read it out. Laws and procedures for responsible borrowing and lending need to be ensured to protect citizens and communities, in particular against corrupt, predatory and odious debts. Professor Ghosh?
Yes, I think this is actually, it's a very important point. You know, we had discussions yesterday that Martin Guzman, who was the finance minister of Argentina, was present. And he pointed out that in Argentina, he brought in a bill that actually requires parliamentary permission before taking sovereign bonds.
Wow.
And that's, why shouldn't we? Why should the people not know? And even decide whether borrowing is even required. And why are you taking it, on what terms, what do you intend to do with it?
Right.
I think that's very important. I think it's also very important to have parliamentary approval of the IMF agreements. Because currently they're all opaque, people don't get to know about it, they just get thrown these results and they're told, oh, it's all technical, you won't understand it, there's no alternative, you have to do this. That's completely wrong. When you think of the countries in Asia that have been in multiple IMF agreements, okay, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Philippines, these are not examples of very dynamic, vibrant, growing economies. And there is a reason for this. It's because the IMF programs actually reduce your capacity for growth. They are pushing an austerity and a tight monetary policy that destroys small and micro enterprises. They're pushing lower demand, and of course it's deeply gender unbalanced, as I have mentioned. And all of that doesn't give you the recipe for sustained growth. So my final point would be, you must have the imagination to move out of this. The imagination and the confidence to recognize what will be good for the people of Sri Lanka and not fall for the advertising of both the IMF and the creditors, which is fundamentally still in the interests of the same elites that are now calling the previous elites corrupt.
Kristina?
Yeah, I want to make 2 points. First, speaking from a German perspective, right? Germany is a creditor of Sri Lanka, right? You know, usually countries like Germany, they say, oh, we cannot do anything because we don't have any claims in the country, right? How can we actually do anything that decides over claims of partner, whatever. But Germany is a creditor to Sri Lanka, so there's much more leeway on doing things differently. And there's another thing that is that in our coalition treaty agreement, we actually have a passus that says we are going to support a codified sovereign debt workout mechanism and support vulnerable countries in getting debt relief. That's there in our coalition treaty agreement. So far, they haven't acted on it, but it actually means that a country like Sri Lanka can say, look, I want a different process. I want certain elements different. It doesn't even mean that you only need this kind of UN level codified whatever, right? It can mean steps before that. It can actually mean, you were just mentioning US, UK law, like national legislation to curb kind of aggressive private sector behavior, right? It could be something like that. It could be, you know, Sri Lanka could actually be brave and say, look, I want something differently, and you actually have a responsibility as my creditor, but also given what you actually promised when, like 2021, when your government came into power. You know, Sri Lanka, like I think it was 3 years ago, before the United Nations, right, was actually saying, we are in a debt crisis and we want, or we would need, a multilateral debt workout mechanism. So something like a legal framework at the United Nations. So kind of taking or making Germany accountable, right, for this kind of. So I think that's one. The other is what I really want to make as a point when we speak about who's going to actually inspire change. You know, end of the 1990s, it was actually citizens and social movements that fought for debt cancellation, right, and were actually the ones that brought this whole discussion that usually, right, is designed, pictured as it's between government ministries and the creditors, right? It's nothing that's actually it's, as you said, too technical, but it's also, you know, there's no transparency on the IMF agreement, right? There's no transparency on the debt relief negotiations right now, right? Citizens just don't know. They don't know what's kind of being discussed right now, right? But it's their right, right? They are also claimants, right? It's not that they are just unaffected. And it was like actually many times it was citizens and social movements bringing from this very technical macroeconomic discussions out of this niche, right? This whole issue, kind of defining it, bring it into the realm, in the public realm as a social justice issue, and actually successfully fought for debt cancellation, for broad debt cancellation, right? And I think right now, this kind of movement, right, that citizens coordinate, right? They come together globally, not only in Sri Lanka, right, but globally, including in creditor countries, to fight for this kind of changes that is needed also for a country like Sri Lanka.
In fact, there is a discussion right now. There was a debt jubilee in 2000, as you know, with cancellation and so on. And there is a lot of movement. Pope Francis has already called for it, for a jubilee in 2025. This is a moment in which to actually bring out all these issues. And Sri Lanka should be active participants.
Sure.
And maybe as a very last word, I can say, like, from the global north, that there's much solidarity and much, like, really willingness to support Sri Lankan citizens in their strive for justice.
Okay. Thank you very much, both. Kristina Rehbein, Political Coordinator of the German Nationwide Debt and Development Network, Jubilee, Germany, and also Professor Jayati Ghosh, Professor, University of Massachusetts. Also, you've been a member of several UN high-level boards, including on effective multilateralism and on economic and social affairs. I had the pleasure of moderating a discussion online last year, which was fabulous. So thank you so much, both, for being here to have these conversations, difficult conversations, but much needed. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again next Friday. Good night.